Hello, I am Kathy Steinert, the Director of Fiscal Services for the Redmond School District. I will be presenting multiple short videos to help our Redmond Schools community understand the district's finances as we begin to discuss our 25-26 school year budget. It's my goal to simplify the budget and ensure that all the district's stakeholders understand how we are funded and how we spend that funding. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the first presentation, part one of K-12 education funding in Oregon. Where does the money come from? This presentation will focus on the state resources that help us fund the majority of our operating costs. The goals for this presentation are the following. I will explain the various different funding sources that provide funding for activities focused on Redmond students. I will discuss the citizen initiatives or ballot measures that have affected how Oregon funds education. I'll provide a history of what is called state formula revenue and the components of that revenue funded by the state called the State School Fund. This pie chart shows the district's current school year's budgeted resources by major fund, totaling $177,378,500. Governmental entities use fund accounting to track resources with specific use restrictions, such as our debt service fund, which can only be used to pay the annual principal and interest payments on our general obligation bonds and our PERS pension obligation bonds. The district's general fund, with a resource budget of $105,458,500, funds the majority of our district's operations and pays the cost of salaries and benefits for most of our team members. In this presentation, I will focus on the general fund. In my next presentation, part two, we will focus on grant programs, which for 24-25 are budgeted at $15,208,300. So let's take a look at the resources which make up our general fund, the district's major operating fund. First, property taxes paid by property owners in the Redmond School District provide $34,141,600, or 32% of our general fund resources. The State School Fund, monies allocated by the Oregon Legislature on a biennial or every 2-year basis, is budgeted at $56,153,400, or 53% of our general fund resources. Together, property taxes and local revenues and the legislatively allocated state school fund make up what is known as state formula revenue. Many years ago, Oregon had a pure levy-based property tax system. That meant that each school district calculated its own tax levy based on its budget needs. School districts were largely dependent on local property taxes for their resources. These local revenues funded approximately 65% of school districts' operating costs. The state funded approximately 35% of school districts' operating budgets. The 1990s brought significant changes to Oregon's property taxation system, thanks to 2 statewide ballot measures which dramatically altered the system and dramatically changed the funding of Oregon schools. Measure 5 was passed in November 1990. Measure 50 was passed in May 1997. Measure 5 capped total property tax levies for education entities, school districts, community colleges, and ESDs to $5 per 1,000 of real market value. This limit on the school operating tax levy explicitly shifted the funding burden from the local taxpayer to the state. Measure 5 required the state legislature to offset lost tax revenues with money from the state general fund, which is composed primarily of state income taxes. As a result, Oregon schools are increasingly supported by state, not local dollars. While Measure 5 simply limited the tax rates used to calculate taxes imposed, Measure 50 changed the concepts of both assessed values and tax rates. Measure 50 capped assessed values to their 1995 level minus 10%. It capped assessed value growth to 3% a year. Under Measure 50, permanent tax rates replaced most levies, making the permanent rates central to the property tax system. At that time, Redmond School District's permanent tax rate was set at $5.0251 per thousand of taxable assessed value. Looking at a property tax statement for Redmond School District property, let's see how to determine what taxes you are paying based on the district's permanent operating tax rate. Up at the top, you'll see school district number 2J and a dollar amount. This dollar amount is based on the permanent rate per thousand of taxable assessed value. The taxable assessed value can be found here on the tax statement. The education total is based on the cap of $5 per 1,000 of real market value. Let's revisit this historical K-12 funding perspective. We can see that post Measure 5 and Measure 50, the state provides approximately 65% of education funding in the form of the state school fund, and approximately 35% of schools funding comes from local property taxes, a role reversal. If we look at the state's biennial state school fund allocation funded by the state's general fund, we can see the impact that relying on an income tax-driven revenue source can have on education funding. For two biennia, 2009-11 and 2011-13, the state school fund either declined or remained flat. This was due to the economic impact of the Great Recession on personal and corporate income taxes collected by the state. We can also notice that in 21-23, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the state underfunded the state school fund to focus on other budget priorities because of the legislature's belief that school districts were adequately provided for by federal COVID relief funds. Following the passage of Measure 5, the Oregon legislature developed and adopted a funding distribution method referred to as the state school fund distribution formula. The funds that are run through the distribution formula include both state funds and local district revenues, primarily property taxes. In adopting the formula, the legislature was attempting to define fairness in meeting the financial needs of school districts. The goals of the formula are to equalize funding across all districts and to equalize funding between districts and education service districts. The state wants to allocate the state and local revenues equitably based on student and district characteristics. The mechanism used to deliver equal financial resources per student for similar groups of students is a student weighting system. The final goal is to compensate districts for cost differences in providing education that are outside the district's control. Students that are more expensive to educate receive a larger weight. The weights are intended to adjust funding for unavoidable cost differences between groups of students. On a simplified basis, the school funding formula distributes the state revenue allocated to K-12 education plus the local property taxes based on the number of students multiplied by a base funding per student multiplied by the cost factors that increase the cost education for a subset of students. Here are the uncontrollable cost factors for which we receive a higher amount of funding. First, we start with our average daily membership, which is the average number of students we educate, factoring in the attendance of those students. For students with an individualized education program, or IEP, we receive an additional full weight. For English language learners, we receive an additional half weight. And you can see the other weights as outlined on this table. This chart shows the estimated average daily membership with the weights for the district for the current school year. We start with an average count of approximately 6,158 students and add a total of 1,258 weights to get the total upon which our formula revenue is allocated. The general purpose grant per our weighted average daily membership is the amount of funds that we receive annually for each student plus the weights. You can see that due primarily to the post-pandemic drop in students, we are 400 weighted students lower than we were in 2007-18. You can also see that since 2007-18, the amount of funding received per weighted student has increased by 35.8%. This final chart shows the amount of total state formula revenue that Redmond School District receives and the rate of the annual increase for the current and prior 2 years. This also shows how those funds break down between the state revenue and the local property tax revenues. For the current school year, we anticipate a 7% increase in our state formula revenue, in part due to an increase of 163 weighted students. Thank you for your attention. Next in our video series will be part 2 of education funding, which will focus on grant funds. Then we will look at how the district spends the funding that we receive. Finally, we will discuss our current outlook for the 25-26 school year budget. I appreciate your interest and welcome your questions.